There are moments in life when we are faced with unremitting suffering. When there is no respite, there is no rest, only more suffering around us. At the end of a career, at the failure of a business, at the death of a loved one. It is at one of these moments of helpless despair that Matthias Grunewald has presented in his small Crucifixion. Here we have Christ on the crucifix, his disciples, St. John the Evangelist and Mary Magdalene near him, and his mother to his side. It is daytime, but there has been an eclipse, and the sun has been blotted out, leaving only a few pathetic stars twinkling here and there, as if about to be blotted out too in the mass despair of the scene. Let us look at his mother. She is facing the death of her son, and not just of her son, but of her hope for humanity. Her eyes are reddened, her mouth is this blue scowl. She looks down, her hands hanging limply in prayer. She is wrapped up in her gowns, which are themselves rather ragged. She is a woman lost to her despair. She is a woman who is utterly helpless before the death of her son. And let us look at his friend, St. John the Evangelist. It seems he has aged rather quickly, seeing his Savior's suffering. His eyes just pouring out tears. There's these deep cuts in his forehead and his brow. It seems his hair has whitened in moments. His hands are twisted in this beseeching motion. He is a man who has faced suffering and privation before. We see that in the tears in his gowns, but this is something new for him. A new level of sadness. And who is it that we have here at the bottom? We have Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, who was redeemed by Christ, who, after having been saved by him, cried at his feet and then wiped her feet with his hair and then covered it with lotion. Here she is, her hands gestured up in disbelief, her mouth open. We hear just that dirge of despair, that high-pitched cry, as she's just horrified at her dead Savior, at the man who redeemed her, at his death right before her. And now, let us take a look at our Christ. Perhaps most interestingly, we have the fact that his crucifix bending under his weight, conveying the sense of him being just inert flesh, hanging from a wooden beam. We look at his hands and we see that black, malignant spike digging into it. His fingers, a bunch of thorns and spikes tensed in its suffering, the tendons running down his arm, and his arm is just a series of sharp angles, almost with so much tension you feel as if his elbow were to rip apart. One feels as if his shoulder had been disjointed. One looks at the other hand, one sees again just that thorn-like helplessness of the hand. We turn to his body, and we note that along with his arms, it has horrifying emaciation. One feels his just ragged flesh hanging from his rib cage. We look down, we see actual rags for his loincloth. As moments about to fall off, barely extant. We look at the quality of his flesh, and it has this greenish tinge of rot, with bits of blood pouring down, and spikes, like little thorns and bristles sticking out from the flagellation from before he had to carry his cross. We look down towards knees and legs, and we see that here the nail has just dug deep as far as possible into his flesh, distorting the flesh around it. We see the way his ankle and toes are twisted beneath there in unremitting suffering. His knees coiled up in that same tension, as if his body were stretched from nail to nail. We look to his head, and his head rests down on his chest, and we see this horrifying storm of spikes, this crown of thorns, for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. A little joke that the Romans put up there, calling him King of the Jews, with this crown of thorns. And look at how awful it is. Just all those little spikes, how it bristles and digs into his flesh. And we look to his face. And in other crucifixions, we see maybe a touch of hope, a feeling that he might be saved later, that he is perhaps suffering but not totally overwhelmed. We do not get that sense here. We do not get a prefiguration of his resurrection at this moment. What we get is not really a face, but rather a mask of suffering. We get rather eyes which are just deeply cut with with the pain, the torture which has racked him. These black dots for eyes staring down hopelessly, a mouth gaping open, with lips blue in their despair. This is no longer a man. This is a consciousness transformed into a mere receptacle for suffering. This is not a man who will be resurrected, we feel. This is a man who has died in the worst manner possible, who has died in a suffering replete and without remission. And it is that kind of suffering, from the physical suffering of Christ to the almost brave but hopeless despair of St. John, to the quiet dejection of Mary, to the screaming helplessness of Mary Magdalene. It is this that we feel when we lose a loved one, when we lose someone close to us. And it is this which Matthias Grunewald has helped us to recognize more clearly, helped us to understand more completely, to know it in our lives.